get started.
We just gonna kick it off.
Just wanted to say thank you to you guys for coming. It's a really nasty day outside, and of course with the love this COVID going around, we really are thankful that everybody came out to hear today's conversation. I've been listening to these two talk about a myriad of titles and opportunities and events for a couple of years now, and I just thought it was about time other people heard it. Patrick Fisher is obviously the leader of Erie Arts and Culture, has been a huge influence on Antonio, and vice versa, I would say Antonio to Patrick. They oftentimes play chess and have their best conversations. It can get a little competitive, so, I'm not going to guarantee it'll be a friendly game. But I just thought that it was a good day for them to sit down and talk about art. The way art helped Antonio through his incarceration period, which was 26 and a half years, in case anyone is not familiar with that. And how it really helped Antonio's reentry, and how art opened the community to him as an individual. And there's so many other individuals like him that don't get that opportunity. And Patrick Fisher and the Manises back here in the back were very instrumental in that happening. So anytime we can have these conversations and open doors for other people, we try to do that. So I'm just gonna let these two talk. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand, and we're a small enough group that these guys will take it from there. So please. Antonio and Patrick.
So I just moved, so it's your move next.
Well, I think maybe to provide a little bit of context there, before we get too in-depth into the game, there was a summer, maybe 2 summers ago, that every Sunday, Antonio, myself, and Marquise would meet in a park over on East 7th Street, and we would play chess. I will say that regardless of the outcomes of this game, I went that entire summer undefeated. So I'd like to think that I made Antonio a better player that summer, to the point that recently he's been beating me. So while I can't vouch for the outcomes of this game, I did have a summer that was undefeated. But on many Saturday mornings, Antonio and I will get together, typically at my house now, and we'll play a game of chess together. I will also say that Antonio is on record of stating that he is at a disadvantage when he's seated at an angle. So if I win today, I'm sure that the win will be discredited relatively quickly, because Antonio is seated at an angle, so let the record show that. But yeah, this is a weekend ritual for he and I, and oftentimes we talk about the role of art in community building, in personal development, and the role that it can play to, I think, encourage discourse on big, broad topics that often otherwise we would avoid because they're uncomfortable. So I do want to thank Antonio and Sarah for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. I also want to credit Sarah. She said that Luther and Connie and myself played a big role in Antonio's welcoming back into the community, but I think she's played an even bigger role. So also recognizing Sarah for all of her work in helping Antonio build his career as an artist, specifically as a community-based artist. So with that, I will, counter your opening move.
And while he's countering my opening move, I'd just like to say there are 2 corrections I'd like to make. I don't beat Patrick, I make him a better chess player. Right? The other thing is that while it is very important to me to always acknowledge those who played a pivotal role in my artistic experience out here, I definitely want to give a special thank you to Sarah, who's my wife. I met her a short while after my release from prison, and without her, I don't think my reentry would have gone as smoothly, given the fact that she was willing to bear a lot of the responsibility of showing me how to relive in society as a normal human being. And there aren't many times that I've met people with the kind of patience and care that she's exhibited to my ignorance about being just a social butterfly and human being out here. So thank you, Sarah. I love you.
So, on the topic of reentry and community, I'd love to have you maybe share with me, as well as everybody that's here today, a little bit about, what role community can play in helping individuals be welcomed back into the community after being removed from the community. And in particular, how has your experience perhaps measured up with your expectations? I'm sure that when you knew that you were going to be, coming back into the community, you probably had a lot of thoughts and ideas swirling around your mind, perhaps some anxieties and aspirations as well. I'm just wondering, what role do you think community can play and has played in your welcoming back, but also how did that measure up against your expectations?
Well, community plays the most important role, right? The fact of the matter is that whether community rejects a person like me with a criminal background coming directly out of prison or is on parole determines our ultimate success, right? So isolation in prison has the effect of making you believe that the world is against you. And there's no way around that, right? Isolation and being in prison, despite what you've been sold by many of our politicians and others, does not somehow inspire pro-social thought processes and behaviors in the people who are in prison, right? And it's important to point that out because my expectations while I was in prison, or coming back out to society, were very low. I had no real expectations of success. I believed that I had no chance to get a job. I believed that I would fail. I would just fail in a different way. I knew that I did not and would not do anything to come back to prison, but it was always my belief that things were set up to ensure that I came back to prison in some shape, form, or fashion, right? I would only be able to get menial jobs despite the fact that I had used my time wisely, acquired journeymans in building trades, an apprenticeship as an electronic technician, was a GED tutor, a Read for Today certified tutor, and other different accolades that I acquired while I was in there. In addition to becoming a self-published artist, a self-published writer and an artist, I still felt that once I came out here, I would be rejected by the community at large and I would eventually fail. So toward the end of my incarceration, I stumbled upon a few books. One was called Lawman by a formerly incarcerated individual who was in federal prison who came out and became a lawyer, right? And it inspired me. It was one of those stories that I heard about that didn't exist, right? Somebody actually came out and made a place for themselves. But one of the elements in the book talked about the welcome that he had when he came back amongst different attorneys. He had a reputation. People gave him a chance, right? That was a community. So community was one of the most important things that I recognized. But how do you gain community support coming directly out of prison, right? I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know if that was a formula. I didn't know if I was even capable of doing it. If anybody wanted to hear someone who had harmed the Erie community in the way that I had before I left, right? Who wants to hear me, right? But what I discovered was that the process was much more organic, and everything that I'd gone through had actually prepared me for my reentry, right? The only thing that I was missing was the opportunity to reconnect with people in genuine ways. And one of those genuine ways was through art, right? I was an artist when I was in prison, came out, I still had that skill. I attempted to abandon that art until I met Patrick Fisher. Patrick Fisher is an ambassador for our community. And I didn't notice initially our introduction was essentially Corey Cook trying to make the introduction between me and Patrick Fisher not showing up at the meeting. That was what I expected from community. That was confirmation that this was the rejection. You know, a man of his stature, director of Erie Arts and Culture, why the heck would he come meet with me? And he didn't show up. Crushed me. Crushed me and confirmed my fears. And at the time, I was employed by the Mental Health Association in Northwestern Pennsylvania as a center team leader. And I went back to my office, and there were messages that were left by different callers when I got back to my office. And one of them happened to be Patrick Fisher. And his voice was the kind of contrition and respect that I didn't expect. Right? I apologize. I live and die by my calendar. I don't know how I missed this meeting. And what he just went on and on and on, and it confirmed to me that he really didn't intend to stand me up, right? And it helped rebuild me, right? I called him back. And we set up, we said we would set up another date to talk and kind of hash things out, and that never really came to pass, right? And I'm taking you through this long story because these are things that led to community introductions that couldn't be choreographed, right? So I think that my response to Patrick Fisher confirmed to him as well that though he didn't know me back then, and confirmed to me that I wasn't the same individual, right? Though I was disappointed, and though the community through Patrick Fisher had stood me up, I had to keep moving forward, right? And moving forward meant that me listening to his message and being able to say, yeah, he really meant this sincerely, and moving on and scheduling another meeting meant that this is another opportunity to expand my connection to community once again. And we've been friends ever since, right? So my expectations coming out here were far less than that, right? And every day that I've been friends with Patrick Fisher and his extended community, my expectations have increased, right? My expectations have far exceeded what I believed my experiences would be while I was in prison, right? And it's because of community. It's because of being embraced. It's because of the kind of humanity shown to me by different individuals within the Erie community who confirmed that I belong back into this community and that I was never not a part of it. I was just isolated and had no connection. So, which is why it's very important to me that people inside prison, currently and in the future, should always maintain connections with the community they harm. And the community, though are reluctant to do so, should never lose the opportunity to reconnect with the people who harmed us. Because it's the only way that you have an opportunity to play a part in the transformation of those individuals. The only opportunity. And if you forfeit that, the individuals who return to our society are less likely to be inclined to believe that there's an opportunity to reconnect with you.
So, thinking about identity as it relates to the arts, as well as everyday aspects of our life. A lot of times with artists, you put qualifiers or precursors on how you refer to yourself, right? There is the emerging artist, the mid-career artist, the local artist, the community-based artist, the incarcerated artist, the formerly incarcerated artist, the black artist, right? And I think that sometimes those identities or those precursors are really important because they can be a reflection out to others that this is possible. There's someone like you that is doing this type of work. But I'm also wondering if at any point in being an incarcerated artist, then a formerly incarcerated artist, now a community artist, if you ever felt like those qualifiers in one way, shape, or form perhaps determined the content of the art that you were making. Have you ever felt like, as an artist that is working to develop original work, that your work has ever been informed or determined by those precursors that either you or others have applied to yourself as an artist?
Yes, absolutely. Early on in my artistic development, I wasn't an artist. I was a person who was discovering myself, right? Art just happened to be a medium I picked up to do that, right? I wasn't a painter. I wasn't, wasn't a portrait artist. I wasn't, an abstract artist. I was just an individual who discovered a medium to pass time. That's it. No different than, kids on the side of the basketball court whose friends happen to be basketball players. They're around it a long time, and you just end up picking up a basketball, right? That's how art was introduced to me. And I don't think that I became or was becoming an artist until other people saw it in me, right? So there were prison staff along the way who would stop by my cell while I was painting and was like, "You the artist?" No, I'm the convict. I'm the prisoner. I'm the N-word that your friends call me. I'm all of that stuff, but I'm not an artist, right? And I started hearing that more and more, right? Like, "Yo, we love your art. Can you do this? Can you do that for us? We got an art show. We inviting all the artists down to the auditorium for an art exhibit, an art sale, and you're an artist." And at some point, I was like, "Okay, I'll go," right? But in actuality, I really don't belong, right? This is a facade. This is just me going along and hanging out. But everybody else saw me as an artist, right? It was therapy for me. It was an outlet. It was all of those things. And then people started seeing me as an abstract artist. So when people would ask me, "What kind of art have you done? What kind of art do you do?" I didn't know what to classify it as. I don't really know, but I heard some people say he's an abstract artist, so I grabbed hold to abstract artist. I'm an abstract artist. And along the way, I heard some other people say I was an African-centered abstract artist. And I settled on that moniker for a while. And once I got a hold of that moniker, I started painting with the intention, I believe, of being an African-centered abstract artist. But I was already headed in that direction. Somebody else just had to identify it for me. But I started to own it and embrace it. And then as I started to own my artistry, I wanted to branch out into the outside world. And I would send people pictures of my art. I would write to Artist Magazine and others. And I got a couple letters back, and realized that I wasn't actually an African-centered abstract artist. I was a prison artist, right? And prison artist trumped whatever other category that I'd been classified as before, right? And mind you, I didn't have the agency in my mind to claim one myself. It was just other people naming me as the artist, right? So once I realized that I was a prison artist, I kind of felt ashamed as an artist because prison artist was a descriptor used by those in the art world, the real art world, to define those of us who weren't really artists. Right? It's a prison artist. And that hurt for a while, but then I kind of got over it because me being a prison artist, I learned also meant that I should be painting prison motifs, right? And I found that out after I wrote a letter to someone once, and they were like, these are all good, but as a prison artist, I don't see your experiences in them, right? And my experiences with prison, right? I'm supposed to be painting prison art. So I rejected the moniker for both those reasons. One, it was negative connotations attached to it, and two, I didn't really paint prison motifs and experiences. So much of my growth and development as an artist had to do with people naming me and then either me claiming it, but never actually naming myself. And the importance of classifying and naming myself wasn't really impressed upon me until I met you. I met an art administrator, right? Because prior to that, I just wanted to paint. Again, like this wasn't a hustle. This was just me staying the course of my life. Art was art. Art brought my father back into my life. It was a conduit. It was a mechanism. It humanized me. I could go anywhere I wanted to in the prison because prison guards, nurses, and other staff members were permitted to purchase my art at the art sales, or they could come to the sale and say, hey, I want that piece right there, and take the money down to the front desk, put the money on my account, and they could walk out of the prison with my painting, right? I didn't care what kind of artist I was. It was just art. It was just, it was the first time that I had actually made money on my own. Far more than the 19 cents per hour that I was relegated to as a prisoner. I created something with my own hands that I could be proud of, that others recognized me for, that I felt like I wasn't able to prior to that, right? But again, it was just growth and development from childhood to adulthood. I wasn't an artist. I wasn't a real artist. I hadn't claimed anything. And when I left prison and I met the Manises, and we painted a mural on the side of the Manasinoco station's wall. That experience for me solidified me being not just an artist, but a muralist, right? Now, mind you, I wasn't comfortable with that title either. I participated in the painting of one mural. I wasn't really a muralist. Why is everybody calling me a muralist, right? And Patrick Fisher contextualized all of those experiences for me. You really are a muralist. Like, it's okay, right? And then I said, okay, maybe I am a muralist, right? I was researching a bunch of different other muralists, and my work didn't compare to their work, and the opportunities they had were far more than those that I had. So I couldn't really be a muralist. I was an artist, but not a muralist. Come on, like really? Um, and really, would muralists even refer to me as a muralist, right? Like in prison, would other artists actually refer to you as an artist? Would a muralist refer to me as an artist? I painted a larger canvas. Does that really make me a muralist? And then, like I said, Patrick kind of contextualized those things for me early in my community art career. And I mentioned community art because that was yet another moniker I never chose for myself, right? It was a term that I heard from you as a community artist, right? But it was one of those monikers that felt right. Like, yo, I am. And I say that because after the first mural I painted on the side of the Manasinoco station's wall, so much community came out to help participate in that mural that I felt like I was somehow responsible for reconnecting points in the community that hadn't been connected in the way that that mural did. Right? I was a community muralist. And from that point on, I started to take control of the trajectory and own that type of community muralist, right? And even my wife, we have conversations about this, and we talk about murals moving forward, how it's always important for us to invite community, right? Especially people who think they can't paint, especially people who think they don't have an artistic bone in their bodies. Because what happened at the Manasinoco mural was that we saw that art being that non-competitive conduit that brought community together allowed people that who would not ordinarily have conversations with each other, who wouldn't ordinarily be in the same circle, to communicate in ways that they thought was impossible, right? Pick up a brush. You pick up a brush, you start laughing, the person next to you, you're worried about splashing paint, and then I walk up to a wall and I just splashed the paint on, and you're like, oh, you just destroyed it? No, actually, I didn't. We can incorporate this. And like, that's what community is. Kids coming up, their parents being afraid that they would mess up the mural, and then my wife facilitating them messing up the mural, right? Like, one of the first requirements to growth and development is that you agree to screw up. We need you to screw up. Screw up so we can grow from it. Screw up so that you know that the screw up isn't the thing that defines you. That we all equal, this is a growth and development process, not just a mural, right? And through conversations with Patrick Fisher, that's what kind of made all of that stuff real. And me owning community murals. And then comes the desire for me to be a politically conscious artist in our day and time, right? How do I do that? How do I make that kind of transition? It brought me back to the term prison artist. It made me want to start owning that descriptor, prison artist. Because what I'm doing out here far transcends what people defined as a prison artist. We aren't people who don't actually do art. We aren't people who are incapable of painting the kind of landscapes and seascapes that other evolved artists can do, right? We're individuals who have an experience that involves prison, but we're artists too. And the two things can exist simultaneously, right? So it's important to me to refer to myself now as a prison artist, even while I'm free, because it affords people who are still trapped in prison doing art the opportunity to see themselves in the same way I needed to see somebody else succeed prior to coming out here. Read a book about somebody else having some of my same similar experiences and coming out here and making something of themselves. And I realized that now owning the title community artist is my responsibility to the me that I left behind there. Other descriptors, like being a Black artist, right? Some of those descriptors are a bit touchy because, as I explained, when I was developing my artistic skills, I didn't see myself as an artist. Many artists who create don't see themselves as a Black artist or one way or another. They're just artists. They just want to create, right? They don't want to be pigeonholed. And many of the monikers, especially a Black artist, comes with it the expectation that your responsibility as a Black artist is to paint the Black experience. But me just wanting to produce art can somehow mean that I betray my responsibility and obligation as a Black artist, right? I just want to be an artist. That's all. And some artists can take those terminologies and, like me, adopt them and run with it, right? And it becomes their personality and identity. You evolve in it. There's some serendipitous process where you suddenly become the spokesperson for Black America through your art, right? Or at least the Black community through your art. And some of us don't want that responsibility. We just want to paint. Even if we paint or create what the Black experience is, once we adopt that moniker, the expectation is we aren't allowed to paint or create anything else. Right? I just want to paint a landscape. Right? That's all I want to paint. Like, why do I have to paint, some experience that quantifies my life coming up in a different neighborhood than you, or whatever? We don't want that responsibility. But I'm learning that as an artist, we have a responsibility to reflect some of the social ills around us. But those are things that come with maturity, not just as an artist, but as human beings and community members, right? As community members, we don't want to be the block captain, right? Like, you just want to be a community member. Just be good to your neighbor. You don't have to call it what it is. It's just, but as you mature, you realize that sometimes you have to take on those roles in order to lead the charge where there might be a void, right? And then you start calling yourself politically active community members, right? And taking on different monikers. But I think art is the same way, and it has been the same way for me. But now I am an artist. I finally own that. I am a Black artist. I am a prison artist. I am a community artist. And I hope that I do all of those descriptors justice, and the other ones that I'm sure at some point I will don in the future.
Check.
Wow.
So there's I think over the last handful of years, if not a little bit longer, there's been a reconciliation around language. And in addition to being a visual artist, you are a literary artist. You're a spoken word artist, a poet. You've published several books. And I'm wondering, with some of the conversations that you and I have, I think we can enter into these conversations because we enter into it, at least I say for myself, knowing that I don't know everything, right? And that there's a degree of vulnerability I can have with you and that you can have with me, and an understanding that if we say something that is either wrong, inaccurate, or potentially harmful, we can also have a conversation about that. And I think that sometimes pockets of our community avoid these conversations out of, a lack of understanding around what the correct terminology is, what words are harmful, etc. So they just avoid the conversation as a whole. And I'm wondering, with an individual who has been welcomed back into the community, who served, nearly 27 years of his life as a formerly incarcerated juvenile individual, what are some of the terms that you think, as it relates to the criminal legal system, we should evolve away from? And what are some terms that you think we can replace them with, if you have any?
So there was one in particular that I'm intimately familiar with when I used to watch the news while I was in prison, right? And it was a term that I would eventually write a poem about called Breaking News. And the term, for me, from my perspective, was designed to break bonds between community and those of us who return to society and trying to get our life together, right? CNN would always refer to young black males who were shot by police as former convicted felons, right? And I didn't notice early on what it did, but the more and more I watched, I realized it, right? It was a way of summarizing a person's life up in such a way that it was okay for you not to care what the facts around the case were. This was a former convicted felon here, right? They would go on to describe everybody else as, decorated military veteran, mother of two, all of these other different experiences that we have as community collectives. But the me that I was seeing on television, former convicted felon. That's it. Former convicted felon. And I think that's one of those terms that I would jettison, right? When talking about an individual whose life experiences happen to have led him to prison, led him or her to prison, right? Things like returning citizen troubles me as well, right? To me, whether I've been to prison or how long I've been in prison doesn't matter, and it doesn't separate me from being a community member, right? And when we start seeing ourselves as separate from the community, especially based on the names that are assigned to us by the community, to make sure that society no longer identifies us as one of you, very problematic. What you get are subcultures trying to figure out how to make their way through a community and society they feel don't want to be a part of them, but require and demand of them to be normal members of society, right? Without the benefit of the name, without the benefit of the acceptance, without the benefit of the acknowledgement as just human beings, right? The other one is and it was particularly important to me because I was a juvenile lifer. And although Hillary Clinton is credited with the title, she wasn't actually the one who came up with it, right? It was super predator, right? As a kid, we were super predators, right? And I was referred to as a super predator. Like, that's another one. Another one is criminal, right? Another one is criminal, like, and it's particularly traumatizing because society assumes that's all I am and that's all I can be. That I can't grow beyond criminal, right? Even the things that I've done since I've been out to demonstrate that I am not who I used to be or what I used to be, even close to it as a child. I'm still a criminal. And interestingly enough, even back then I was never referred to as a child, right? I was called a delinquent. Never a child, never a kid, right? The juvenile delinquent. And those titles have the effect of allowing community to separate themselves and their interests from individuals who we assign those titles to, right? You are no longer a human being. You are the sum total of what this title says that you are, right? No different than negative descriptors pertaining to race, pertaining to sex, pertaining to choices in relationships or how many relationships you have. Nobody wants to be defined by those things, right? You walk into a room and somebody says, you got the cooties, right? And no, we are adults. Essentially, that's what those titles are, right? They are grade school arbitrary assignments to people that we want to humiliate and dehumanize or pick on. You got the cooties. I don't know what the hell the cooties are. All I know is that the rest of the class, the rest of my community, doesn't want to be around me because I got the cooties. How do I get rid of the cooties? Can anybody in here tell me how to get rid of the cooties? Now, as a human being, I struggle with the same inability when it comes to figuring out how I can get rid of the title that is the same as the cooties. Like, there's nothing I can do. Nothing. It can come out here and be the best human being that I can be, or the best human being that you've ever seen. But I still got the cooties. So, sorry, can't help you, can't hire you. We won't rent to you because it says here you got the cooties. Yeah, but I've been cootie free for 2 years. At least I thought I was. I don't really know how to get rid of the cooties, but I've been cootie free for 2 years. Like, this doesn't matter. Yeah, but they said you had the cooties, and and so those are some of the ones I would jettison and simply refer to people as, human beings first, right? The same way that you would want to be seen. Like it doesn't take anything for a person to look past or ignore the cootie label, right? It doesn't take a person to walk into a classroom and say, yeah, I know everybody's saying you got the cooties, but I'm still going to be your friend, right? I'm still going to be your friend. And if that means that now I got the cooties, then we're going to have the cooties together. Right? And those are the kind of friendships that I've discovered since I've been out here. My wife, Patrick Fisher, Mary does it. The list goes on, right? I'm walking around Erie County with the cooties, man. And, criminal, former convicted felon, reentrant, all of those things that say cooties to people, even though, no matter how anodyne the substitute for former convicted felon is, right? Reentrant, may not be as abrasive or offensive as former convicted felon to other people, but it's still the same to me. It still has the same effect, right? And those are all titles that have been codified in law that permit people to discriminate against me legally, right? No matter how much I'm trying to get my life back together or others coming after me have decided that we want to live pro-social, law-abiding lives, we're relegated to second-class citizens, right? And I believe that the only way that the community can move forward as a collective is if we jettison terms like that. And I say as a collective because for a community to hold on to monikers like that, and I can guarantee you that as much as you want to maintain the hatred and the memory of the traumas we've caused, not facilitating the opportunities for us to change and changing along with us ensures and increases the potential for it to reoccur. Right? The only thing that me being a former convicted felon, reentrant, and the parolee, it's another parolee, right? The only thing that maintaining those titles does for a community is ensure that I will never grow beyond any of those things. Right? So it's an admission that society wants me to stay where I was, while at the same time demanding better and safer communities for us all. Right? How do you invest in future destruction by ensuring that you have people who will never be allowed to grow beyond their worst mistake? And then complain that our communities aren't any safer than they were to begin with. Like we actively participate in preserving, right? This is not to say it's the community's fault for our actions, our choices, and our violations. But at some point, we have to understand that we begin to actively and participate in the perpetuation of it. Right? I'm invested in the transformation of my peers coming out of prison after me for several different reasons, right? I know that my continued success is inextricably tethered to their success, right? They're my peers, our little amongst them. We get frustrated, angry or something like that, and somebody wants to lash out, I'm the closest one, right? I have a personal interest in my safety, right? Apart from anything else, apart from caring about human beings, apart from understanding the rehabilitation process, apart from any of that, right? I have some self-interest too, right? So what does it benefit me to make sure that this person's past traumas are never resolved? What does that benefit? He wronged me in the past. Now we'll make sure that his past traumas are never resolved. Hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. And heal people heal people. So why wouldn't I invest in trying to heal him or her? Why wouldn't I? Right? And you start that process by, one, viewing people as human beings and referring to them as human beings, right? And these aren't prisoners. These aren't inmates. That's another one. These are imprisoned human beings. And these are our citizens. These are our friends. These are our families, right? These are members of our society who we have to maintain connections with, because our connection might be one of the only peaceful relationships in their lives. I remember as a kid, I was friends with former city councilman Curtis Jones. He'll tell you this too, right? So his family, his mother and father, really raised him well, right? And I was witness to it. And I remember there were times when I would go over to his house and they didn't want me around, right? And as an adult, I understand now why, right? You don't want your kids around what you believe to be bad influences, right? And if you identify me as a bad influence, of course, you separate your kids and they have more opportunity for success. The thing that adults who didn't want me around their children would never acknowledge was that when I walked into their house, that was the first time I would have to say grace at the table. Right? That was the first time I would have to wash my hands before I ate. Right? Maybe the first time I would have to take my shoes off. Maybe the first time I would have to refer to his mother, his father, his ma'am, and sir. Like that's my only opportunity to get what I ain't getting at home. And as concerned as you are that your children, and as concerned as his father and mother were that their child would be negatively influenced by me, they never credited Curtis Jones with the ability to influence me. You hear me? I remember being in prison, always thinking about that. Hearing about his trajectory, and this was my best friend. we did everything together. Like we would stand in the school halls and we look up at the threshold of the door, jump up and kick the door, right? Like we all thought we was ninjas back then. Like that was the thing. And for the record, I was faster, smarter, stronger, all that stuff, right? He'll tell you something different, but I mean, yeah, I say that to say, those are the experiences that I had as a child while never being acknowledged or referred to as a child because of the monikers that were given to me, assigned to me, some might say earned as a juvenile delinquent. I wasn't a kid anymore. Nobody could see me as that. So yeah, I would jettison all of those descriptors that I just referenced, man. And we'd just be human beings together, man. Like, if I break a law, make a mistake, if I wear my pants down to my butt, it doesn't mean I'm no longer a child. It doesn't mean I'm no longer a human being. It doesn't mean I'm no longer a member of the community. It doesn't mean I'm a criminal. It doesn't mean that I'm a former convicted felon. It doesn't mean that my life should be summarized with a negative terminology that follows me forever, even when I'm trying to escape it. Even after I pull my pants up. Even after I practice pro-social behaviors. Even after I get off drugs. Even after I do community service. Even after I try to mend the wounds that I'm responsible for. Even after all of those things. Even after I'm committed to making sure people don't do the same things that I did before. I'm out of check, by the way.
So I think one of the things that appeals to me about community-based art is that oftentimes the end result, there can be conversations around, is this art, right? I think that it's not necessarily something that you're going to see on the wall of a museum or performed on the stage of a performing arts center. It's something that is owned by the community, of the community, for the community. And I think about like these rituals and traditions of community. And I think that in the criminal legal system, we have a ritual and a tradition by way of court, right? And when somebody is sentenced to a term in prison, there is a ritual and a tradition around that. There is even an audience associated with it oftentimes. There can even be actors associated with it. And yet, when someone comes back into the community, there's not often a ritual or a tradition. So, as someone that is a community-centered artist, such as yourself, if you could think of a ritual and a tradition that would welcome people back into the community, that helped maybe counterbalance that ritual and tradition that sent them away from the community, what would such a ritual, like what ritual and tradition would have served you, and what do you think of in service to others?
One of the first things that comes to mind is it should be a ritual that when we find people who are charged with crimes or convicted of crimes, that as a community we reach out to them and start a conversation, right? And that conversation should involve and be a protracted conversation, right? For the duration of their incarceration, the duration of their lives, right? And I say this because during that conversation, there's a point at which a person's transformation leaves them so vulnerable that they aren't sure which direction to go with, right? Because when an individual is brought up in an environment or is so convinced that in order to ward off being bullied or just being the outcast or not being in the in crowd, an individual who participates in violations to the community has to abandon everything that they've learned up to that point. Everything. Leaves you completely vulnerable and receptive to whatever you choose to surround yourself around or the things that surround themselves around. You're starting from the beginning again. And when you start over from the beginning and community ain't around, you ain't got a say in how we build ourselves up. None. None. Right? So the conversation has to be a protracted one because we reach that point, like I reached that point in my life, you need the community to start making demands of you. You need the community to give you marching orders. You need people to say, hey, why don't you consider this book and we can talk about it? You need people to tutor you. Right? It doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be about proselytizing. Just through the conversations as organic as you might experience with any other friendship. Right? Why do you think this way? These are questions we won't be asked by the professional prison administrators that you've left our rehabilitation to. Right? We won't be asked, what can we do to ensure that this behavior won't happen again? How do we facilitate your growth and development? And your reentry and your introduction back into our lives in a safe and humane way. We won't be asked any of those questions through our rehabilitation. What we'll be told, however, is we will take classes like victims awareness, where we will hear stories about people who were victimized, identify ourselves in those stories, and then be told we are not victims because we victimized somebody else. This ain't about you. It's about the people you victimized. Those traumas will never be dealt with. They will never be addressed. We will be told they don't matter. Get over it. This is about you atoning for your wrongdoing. And that leaves many of us with jaded perspectives. Right? The timeline of trauma doesn't start in our lives. It starts when we traumatized you. This is really distorted timeline. So now we spend our lives trying to contextualize how is it that me traumatizing you is more important than me being traumatized, right? Both are important. Both are significant. One is never acknowledged, so it festers. It festers. And we go on struggling with that, constantly. Go on struggling with that, right? And you hear things like, from my father, I beat you the way I did because my dad did. And I turned out just fine. You know I choked you unconsciousness. I know I tied you up and peed on you in a bathtub, but it worked for me. I turned out just fine. And if you believe that by being absent from the conversation that will inform our growth and development in the future is an investment, a positive investment in future community, then you're wrong. Be a part of the conversation. That has to be a ritual, right? As much as people are in the courtroom taking notes, cheering that you've been convicted and you got your just desserts, right? There has to be a ritual of community saying, okay, now we start again. We need to talk to you. We need some answers. Understand that to get those answers, we need to establish a relationship. How do we do that? Let's have a discussion. It's about a personal discussion. Right? And I'm not saying you need to coddle people. I'm not saying you need to finance their incarceration. I'm not saying any of that. You need to be a part of the discussion. The ritual needs to include you in our transformation, our rehabilitation. When we return home and we have no relationships to you, what interest do I have that you flourish? I don't care about your business. It's in my community. But none of that money is coming to my community. I have no personal relationship to you. None. I walk past you every day. I buy bread and milk and butter, and you grit on it. Now switch that relationship around. What relationship would you have with me? You walk through my community, I ogle you, I look at your purse, I say bad things to you, I spread rumors about you. Like, what relationship do we have? We have an adversarial one. It existed before we went to prison. It exists after we come out of prison. And the only opportunity to usurp that is if the community participates in the transformation process. And there is no mechanism currently in place in the Department of Corrections that allows community to participate in the process. That should concern you. That should concern you. So that ritual needs to include the community communicating with us afterwards. That ritual needs to start there. And then when we come home, the same thing. The friendships, the connections, right? Hey, how you doing? Yeah, yo, got my eye on you. And then the expectation for us to do better, right? Yo, I'm expecting a lot of good things out of you, right? And then the opportunity to do better. And the resources to do better. Not, I expect you to do better. However, you still got the cooties, and we ain't hiring you. Don't go back to sell drugs. That's not good for anybody. But we will never hire you. We need you to pay all your court costs and fines. You realize that your court costs and fines are $20,000. You committed the crime, got that. You need to pay your debt to society. But you are relegated to $725 for the rest of your life. And you will not move beyond that. And if you don't pay these court costs and fines off, you're going back to prison. I understand you got child support. I understand all of those irresponsible decisions you made in the past. That's your problem. But we need and expect you to move forward. The ritual has to be viewing yourselves and us and our destinies as being inextricably linked. You cannot untether the two. Though we might try, you cannot untether the two. You know, there are those of us who may believe that we can. If you are affluent enough to live in communities where you will never have to see any of us ever again, right? I'll guarantee you, you'll have to face it when your son or your daughter gets in trouble. And all of a sudden, all of the resources in your power within your community will come to bear to assist them. All those same things should be afforded to all of us, including you when your opportunity comes to make mistakes. When you decide that you want to transform your life for one reason or another, or your son or daughter does, or your nephew does, or you understand that some people got a bad rap, or you know, whatever it might be, like that ritual has to include seeing yourself in us, communicating throughout the incarceration process and afterwards. And not asking for permission from society to do it. Doing it. That ritual has to include reaching out to people who, with different experiences, unlike our own, and making those connections, right? Hearing the voices, sharing experiences, and making the kind of connections that we make during our community meal, right? So that's what that ritual would look like to me, Patrick.
I also want to say that usually when Antonio and I talk, the F-bomb is dropped a lot more than expected. So I do want to acknowledge the fact that we've had some really heavy conversations so far this afternoon, and not once have we uttered an F-bomb, which is pretty rare tradition for us. It's also a lot more difficult to play chess when you know you have a live audience and you're trying to engage in a conversation of substance.
These are the excuses that I often use when I start winning the game.
All right.
But
Antonio, were you doing art before you were incarcerated?
No. Well, yes and no. If you ask my grandmother, she'll say I've been doing art my entire life, but I have no recollection of it. Right? And it may lend some credence to why I could never really see myself as an artist. Like, I don't remember what she's talking about, right? So yes and no, because I don't question what my grandmother says anymore, right? I can't own that memory. I don't know.
Maybe she saw how you thought.
Yeah, perhaps.
Also, my apologies. I saw how quickly you can get cooties. My apologies for my phone going off.
No.
But I think, we've been talking for about an hour now. And none of this is scripted, by the way. We didn't even have a conversation about what we could be having a conversation about. But I also knew that in our conversations, there's always a lot that's covered. But I think that with us having talked for about an hour now, is there any other questions that you as community members and active participants in today may wish to ask Antonio as I find my way out of the check?
I really appreciate your vulnerability and truthfulness about the different voices that you've heard. Even hearing at first the good when you said, well, they call me an artist. And then you go, wait, I can't be, and the negative, there were negative voices and positive. All that. It's nice you brought up that society puts the cootie label. I Anyway, time to take off the cootie glasses.
Yeah.
I pray that may happen. But thanks for being just so cool and wonderful about your journey.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I want to hear about your artwork too at some point today.
Oh, yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
absolutely. What, I don't know what to tell you about my artwork.
We'll start with, if you haven't seen, besides just these pieces that are here today, if you actually walk over to the section between the entryway and the children's section of the library, there's a collection of Antonio's work that's kind of chronologically curated right now. So in addition to seeing the pieces that are behind you, I'd encourage you all to walk over there after today as well to see that work.
Yeah, chronologically curated by my wife, Sarah, by the way. Right. Once again.
Most of what's there, to keep it in context for you, he did while he was in prison. So he didn't have the same types of supplies, easels. I mean, we're talking sitting on a bed with a canvas in his lap, including some of the frames were actually by him while he was in prison. But all of that is stuff that was produced while he was incarcerated. The only thing other than a mural right now that was produced after he was released is the original Erie stamp, which the original is actually in the Heritage Room. It's the archive. Other than that, I think it's all murals at this point.
Which needs to change.
I knew he was going to say that.
We talk about daily practice a lot as an artist. You know, for myself as an arts administrator and a non-practicing artist, I often remind Antonio that to be an artist requires making artwork. And I think that, you know, I'm going to speak candidly on my relationship with you. But I think that when you have the Cootie label associated with you, you can feel like a lot of, if not all of your time has to be going towards reconciliation with the community so that they recognize that title is no longer appropriate. And when you think about maybe some of the past harms you did, how you are righting those wrongs. And in the process, any time you dedicate to yourself can feel like greed or something that is unearned, right? And I recognize in Antonio this work ethic towards the community that I think I'd love to see him just, you know, reclaim a portion of that time and invest it back in himself. And doing so in a way that there's not a shame associated with it. Because I think that all of us have to invest in ourselves if we want to invest in others. And I think that with Antonio, I often push him heavily to develop some type of daily practice as an artist. And to think about, you know, concept, technique, process, but having a ritual around making art on a regular basis that's intended only for him. Because as a muralist, that work's not for him, right? The community owns it just as much as he owns it. And if you have a client that you're making work for, that work is for them. And I'm still trying to draw out of Antonio, since his welcoming back into the community, what's the work that's clawing inside of him to get out now? You know, we've talked about some of the work that he's done in the past, but if you were to create work just for yourself, what is that work? I remember when we commissioned Antonio to do the original piece, which is the portrait of Harry T. Burley, which was for the first annual Harry T. Burley Week, I got this phone call from him. And a lot of Antonio's excited phone calls start the same way. Yo! And I remember, like, it was the simplest thing, but there was so much joy behind it, which was painting on an easel. Like, yo, do you know how great easels are? And then you can paint on them? Because, you know, as Sarah mentioned, like, when he was incarcerated, was sitting on your bed with your canvas on your lap and doing this. And being able to, like, have an easel that you're working from and proper lighting and be able to step back from the piece And I just remember getting this phone call with such sheer excitement over something as small as an easel. And just thinking like, I want to work with artists that are that excited, right? About the things that oftentimes we take for granted. And even to this day, every project that Antonio embarks on, there's always this aha moment in the work. And I always get that same phone call, like, yo, Patrick Fisher. Like, and I'm also hardly ever just Patrick, it's always Patrick Fisher.
It's usually Patrick and
But I'm always so excited to receive those phone calls because, that type of excitement I think is contagious. And when Antonio is also working with other community members and he's able to share that excitement with them, I just think that remarkable things happen. But, talking about your work and your process, I know that you don't want to stay too heavily in past works necessarily, but speak a little bit about your work.
So
It's also your turn.
no, I pushed my rope here
Okay.
to threaten it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, my process has evolved. Initially, when I was painting, I stumbled into a series of mask designs, right? So, when I was 15 in prison, fighting for my physical safety was just as important as fighting for my mental sanity. And I had identified early on that a shield was both the ideal defensive and offensive weapon, right? So many of my mask designs replicate the shape of a primitive shield, right? Kind of like this. And I saw African shields, various different shields around the world through books and magazines. So I started drawing intricate designs on the shields themselves, right? It was just a pastime. Right? There's nothing more than that, nothing more significant. But I was infatuated with the shield. And at one point, I incorporated an eye into one of my shields, right? Which morphed into another eye. And the shields turned into masks, right? Which, to me, the human countenance is both the ultimate defensive and offensive weapon, right? Like you can discourage someone from being around you with a facial expression, and you can invite people into your circle with a smile, right? So to me, they were synonymous, right? The shield and masks, and they ended up becoming one through my artistic process, right? And again, none of this was intentional. I need you. I'm not an artist that can say, yeah, I studied the shields of Western Africa, and I decided I was just tinkering, right? I was just tinkering. But after I figured out that they were masks, and when I started continuing to incorporate all of the different intricate designs, they just started to be aesthetically pleasing to me. And many of my final designs have meanings far removed from the meanings that people who appreciate them attribute to them, right? My process was organic, serendipitous. I don't know how to describe it as anything other than that, right? But I started painting my moods through the masks, right? The facial expressions, trying to suss out the warrior ethos in the face through the depiction of warrior women. At that time, I was studying Black history, and black women and the female figure, to me, took on an almost regal representation of the ultimate warrior, right? While men in this world were always attributed with being warriors, it just felt like to me what I was reading that was a lie. Like women were the ultimate warriors. So I started incorporating that kind of stuff into my artwork, right? Women with wings and staffs and spears or shields, just that whole philosophy was incorporated into those masks. But I was kind of finding myself, right? And I would read books and discover that somehow some of those things were incorporated into my mask. And we can talk about each one individually, but that was the general idea. Then I got to a point where I needed to make money. And masks were kind of my thing. So portraits would be the next logical transition, right? And so I started painting portraits for people and realized that my portraits started looking more like masks. And I stayed away from portraits. I didn't really like them. It didn't allow me the opportunity to create the kind of range that I was used to in my masks. And other people started asking me to start painting more things for them. And I didn't like the idea of painting for people. So I discovered that my process was personal. My process was something that I didn't feel comfortable sharing with people because it was personal to me, right? And it was the only thing that I really owned, right? And the biggest ownership in that was the secret that I really didn't know what my process was, right? I'm still a freaking kid, I'm still learning, but I'm living in an environment that requires you to pretend that you got it all figured out. And if you don't, something's wrong with you, right? There's a vulnerability, there's something not right with you. And to prevent myself from experiencing that over and over again, where everybody else got it figured out, I would later learn that everybody else was pretending too, right? But at that time, I didn't know that, so my process was personal and private in that way. And I would come up with what I thought was aesthetically pleasing art, and what everybody else thought was just freaking phenomenal, right? To the point where one of the most flattering and offensive questions I would be asked by many people was, including staff members in prison, was, "You did that?" Wait, you did that? Right? And initially, it was flattering. And then I realized that what they meant intentionally or unintentionally was that prior to seeing it, they didn't think I was capable of it. You did that? For real? You ain't tracing or nothing. So you saying you ain't get that out of a book, you ain't, seriously, like ain't nobody who did that for you, sure? Yeah. Right, and it was a process of discovery for me, right? It wasn't intentional, like, so the portion of it that started to become formulaic and resemble a process was when I started reading a lot of art books, right? That would tell you to wash your canvas with burnt sienna, backgrounds. Like one of the things I have difficult time doing is seeing the image that's there, because I'm convinced that there's always an image that exists on a canvas. Seeing the image that's already there when it's just a white surface. But when you wash your canvas with burnt sienna, whatever color it might be, It's like a sculptor seeing a rock in all the shapes, or you looking at the clouds and you can see a shape that nobody else can see. And then all you're doing is bringing out that shape. Like it's really, that was a process, right? I discovered that as a process, right? And then for a while, I started writing on my canvases before I would paint on them, right? I would like write a word, like empowerment, right? Across the canvas, throw some burnt sienna on it. And that would be like my motivation to focus, right? Empowerment. What mask would represent empowerment and strength to me, right? No, that shape doesn't say that. No, that doesn't say that. But I could always still see the lettering underneath, and it was just like reinforcement. But again, this wasn't like an intentional process for me. It wasn't like a formalized, this is how you do things. This is just what it was. And I would make a lot of mistakes along the way, like the words that I would write on the bottom of the canvas would be so watered down that eventually the paint that I put on top of it wouldn't adhere where the words were, right? The process of learning now, like I know now that you need medium instead of water, water. So that was and I primarily used acrylics. Early on, I started off with Winsor Newton's water mixable oils, right? And I loved them. I didn't choose them. Somebody actually gave them to me. But I loved them because the paint seemed like it would never dry. And I could just go back days later, just going in. Because we didn't have any oil mediums for it, right? We didn't have nothing that would help it dry faster. It was just going back into it and continue touching up stuff and blending and that kind of thing. So that was a process, if you will, right? Fast forward to my transition back into the community and delving into murals. I had no process. I painted murals while I was in prison, right? Painted about 4 or 5 of them. One in the prison visiting room, and the rest, I believe, in like the staff dining area where nowhere the prisoners would ever see it. It was just for staff, right? And there wasn't a formalized process. I never painted murals prior to that. I just knew that this is a heck of an opportunity. I'm gonna fake it till I make it. I don't know if I can produce what this is, but I'm gonna try. So painted a couple murals there. And so when I transitioned into the Erie community, and one of the first murals that I was invited to do was the Manasinoco, Patrick Fisher. He exposed me to a process, right? It was called doodling. So we were thinking about scaling up images using the grid method, where everything is squared up, the lines are straight, perfect, and similarly laid out that same way on the image, and then you would just kind of match up where the lines intersect and stuff like that. That would be your guide. Patrick introduced me to a method called doodling that was used by graffiti artists that has been the only formula we use now moving forward, right? The doodle method involves just throwing random shapes up on the wall, stars, letters, numbers, whatever you want to do. It looks like you've defaced the surface area, right? It's like graffiti. It's just random happy faces, smileys, whatever it is, handprints, whatever it might be. And that serves as your grid. You take a photograph of it on a smartphone, and the image that you intend to put on the wall, you put it into a photo blender program, and you overlay the transparent version of the image over the picture that you took of the dude in Erie. And I never figured out how to explain this straightforward to people. You got to see it to understand it, unless you are just so much smarter than me that I couldn't figure it. But anyway, and that's the method and formula that we use for our murals, and it's important to use that formula for my wife and I because it allows the community to come in and participate. Don't matter what you put up on the wall. Just draw a mark. Just draw. And that becomes your grid, right? You look at the image, and if the line is going through the star where the eye is, that's where you put your line through the star where the eye is. If the line is going straight down through the nose on your image, that's where you put down the line in the image, right? And so community is able to participate in that and see it grow organically, right? And so now that is our formula and that is our process, right? With regard to painting personal images, I think that my evolution as an artist in that area is still evolving. And I'm grateful because just like we talked about, you reach that point of transformation where you become vulnerable and you need outside voices to give you marching orders and guide you. And see what you can see, right? And try to project you into these different areas and see which one fits, right? Patrick Fisher has become that for me, right? Antonio, you need to develop a process. You need to paint more. You need to formalize this. You need to think more about this. That has been a lot of our relationship, right? For me, he's what I always call the third option, right? When you have a mindset when you think of everything as binary, which is where I've come from. And then if you're lucky enough, you run into friends and develop relationships that give you the third option. That's always how. Always. And so I've been trying to develop processes and think differently about what the next iteration of me as an artist will be outside of community murals. And I haven't developed a process for that. I haven't created a body of work since I've gotten out of prison beyond community murals. But personal work I haven't delved into except for the Harry T. Burley portrait, and even this didn't start out the way it is. It was the Harry T. Burley portrait, the stamp, and then after an experience that I'm almost certain all artists go through where your art is not valued because of who your audience believes you are. I threw up Ain't I Worth It on there, right? Because his life experience was unacknowledged at one point by the Erie community at large. And then there's the Harry T. Burley Legacy Alliance trying to get people to recognize the value of Harry T. Burley. This is an Erie composer and musician, right? And one of their desires was to have him recognized on a U.S. stamp. So essentially, we're asking the question, ain't Harry T. Burley worth being on that stamp, right? But my question was, ain't I worth it as an artist for you to respect me beyond what it is you just posed to me as being something worth you taking all my rights to my work? Ain't I worth it? If you're talking about Harry T. Burley, right? And I find that it's interesting when you run into people who are fighting for the acknowledgement of history and our appreciation and valuing of the things in history and devaluing the leadership that is among us today. right? Because they don't see you as being the same as Harry T. Burley. They don't see you as having the same struggle as an artist, right? You're just an artist. But we need you to render this in order for us to get our point across. But we need you to know that you ain't worth what you're asking. Just do it and shut up. So my pushback was Harry T. Burley has the stamp, and across it, ain't I worth it? We're not talking about him in red letters. We're talking about the artist. Ain't I worth it? That's my process.
I think you're being a little long-winded in your responses, so you can delay this game.
Well, I'm trying to spare you the humiliation of losing in front of the camera.
Do we have any other questions from anybody else in the audience?
I have a question. Your discussion helped me better understand your success as an artist. I would be curious as to your success in getting through the mundane as a released prisoner. How did you find work? How did that work out for you? Who gave you a chance?
In the end, it worked out great for me, right? I'm currently a paralegal for the Federal Public Defender's Office, right? And I've been at that job for 2 years. Lisa Freeland, Maria Gelman, members gave me a chance, right? So, Maria Gelner was, back then, when I was resentenced, my defense attorney. I went back for resentencing. Maria Gelner represented me and is largely responsible for me having a reduced sentence and making my transition back into the Erie community. She is a friend, local attorney, superhero in my book. But what Maria Gelner did above and beyond her job as my defense attorney was to see me as more than just a client, but as a human being and a community member. Maria actually set up a job for me before I was even released, right? She worked in conjunction with the Opportunities Unlimited of Erie, right? And got them to commit to hiring me before I was even released.
And that's not something public defenders normally will do, right?
At all. So when I got out, I went and worked as a janitor, essentially for Opportunities Unlimited of Erie. They were housed in the Stairways building. They're no longer there, but they were housed in the Stairways building. And I worked there as a janitor. It was a part-time job. Worked as a janitor and part-time in their dry cleaning business, right? Young's Cleaners, out on Route 20. I worked there back and forth. I used to overdress for my job. I believe long before I got out, my philosophy was you dress for the future of your choosing and not for where you are, right? As a result of my work ethic and the way I dressed, they decided to promote me to a job coach and job developer, where I found jobs for people with disabilities, mental and physical disabilities, right? And I did my job well. I loved my job and was committed to it, right? Still part-time work though, right? Along the way, I applied for another part-time job at the Mental Health Association of Northwestern Pennsylvania. I left prison as a peer support specialist, right? As certification as a peer support specialist. And I applied there as a peer support specialist. They hired me not as a peer support specialist, but as a center team member, right? I kind of worked in the consumer drop-in center, right? And it's important that I explain this entire employment history to you. So I worked there for a little while, and then a job opened about 6 months into my employment there, part-time, mind you, for center team leader. So the job essentially entailed managing the staff of 13, right? It's a full-time job, benefits, all that kind of stuff. So I was there 6 months or so, and I applied for the center team leader job. And they hired me. Thought I did a phenomenal job, and hired me. And I was there at that job for, a little under 6 or 9 months. And an opportunity opened at the Federal Public Defender's Office for an investigator. And I said, what the hell? I'm not going to tell me no, right? Everybody else around me is telling me don't apply for these positions. So, long story short, while I'm applying for these jobs, everybody is telling me not to because they're not going to hire you. You got the cooties. We know how the cooties work. I got you, but I'm not going to tell myself no. I applied for the jobs, went for the interviews, and I got hired. It wasn't an easy road, right? I didn't see that early on. It was a struggle without medical insurance, not even knowing the importance of medical insurance, having to get welfare assistance to augment what little money I was receiving as doing part-time work, having to deal with the opposition of my parole officer not wanting me to work overtime, not believing that my work ethic was such that he should afford me the ability to work beyond my curfew hours. All of that played a part, right? And then going into interviews where people were able to see past the cooties. He said, listen, we'll give you a chance. Literally, listen, we'll give you a chance. And then making sure that I outwork everybody around me to maintain that position. You hear me? It was difficult, still is, but that was essentially my journey. But that journey, and I mentioned Maria first, particularly because that journey started with community, man. Not a defense attorney, community.
That's just what I was going to say. It earns what you're saying. The person in the community kind of best understands the situation, that you have a community problem that requires a community resolution. It's, in many ways, it's education. If the community better understood that, she understood that well.
Understood.
And led to wanting to provide an opportunity and a pathway to success.
No
I'm gonna
doubt.
go for this because it's related. I'm in college right now, working to be a social worker, and I'm really interested in the prison system and trying to get involved in some way, help either within or around the incarceration system. Do you know if there are any organizations or groups currently in place to help people who were incarcerated be welcomed into the community? Is there some sort of transitional body that helps people find their way back into the community outside?
Yeah. So before I left prison, there was an organization that was just getting started called Erie County Reentry Services and Support Alliance, working out of GCAC. Supposed to facilitate the transition of people coming home from prison. Right. I was probably their highest risk case since then, while they were just developing. Right. And they were organized in conjunction with the gun violence reduction strategy of Unified Erie, right? To offer resources to people coming home from prison to facilitate that transition, right? It didn't work for me. By and large, whatever the program's successes are, I have no intention of undermining or trying to devalue them, but they exist. But for me, this is why my ritual suggestion to Patrick was that the reentry process start before you leave prison, not afterwards, right? You can advocate for somebody to get a good job after they're released, but a person with no connection to community who just has a good job, you still have a person with no connection to the community, right?
Doesn't seem like the parole system would be very forgiving to somebody who's coming out and then looking for a job.
It's not. It's a recipe and an investment in future returns to prison, despite what we sold, right? And I didn't really understand that until I started going through it. And when you make a complete and total commitment to transform your life and focus on moving forward, I think that's really the only moment that you can really identify how many obstacles are in your path, and not understand why this would be in your path. Like I'm trying, I'm moving on. Like, how is this possible? So I discovered a hell of a lot of them. But to answer your question, yes, it exists, and there's another organization called Climate Changers that I've heard good things about, but I didn't have the pleasure of going through their program. But I've seen some things on TV, heard other people talk about it, and I've asked to try and work in conjunction with Climate Changers. One thing I learned about these organizations is that there are silos, right? And when people develop organizations to try to assist, they start out with really good intentions and end up reproducing a paradigm of organizational structures that isolate themselves from the very solutions that they organized to create, right? And it's unfortunate, right? Like, so the two organizations don't work together, right? And so are always vying for funding from the same sources, and so they're by default in competition, though outwardly you would never hear that acknowledged, or no one would ever actually say we're in competition, right? It ends up being that. And I believe that those organizations would be better served by adopting a more holistic communal approach, right? And that holistic communal approach is that community be involved as a collective. It's you and me, it's everybody, right? To be involved as a collective. To know Connie Manners, to know Patrick Fisher, to know others. And us all having a clear understanding and objective to being part of the solution. Yeah, that's a long-winded answer to me avoiding.
So I think we were slated to go until 3 o'clock today, which means we're winding down our time. We have about 8 minutes left. We have a question in the back here.
I do have, I just started visiting at Mountain, and one of the common themes that people that are incarcerated, they're just, they feel like we're trying to change what force of prison and supporting that. And I'm looking for like sometimes magic words to say to help them keep the faith even in the day-to-day situation that's not real good. And I wonder if you have any magic words.
Yeah, I'll write a letter. Right? So, in most instances, what we're looking for is some confirmation that there is somebody out there who cares enough to reach back into the prisons and lodge an objection to us not having those kind of opportunities to change in the way we want to, right? Like, it starts with you. your magic words are, I care, I'll see what I can do, and I'll write a letter, right? Sometimes it'll go from there organically. You may not be able to come up with the ultimate answer that alleviates everybody's stress and whatever doubts that they have. But gestures, communal gestures, right? Just keep your gestures communal, right? What would you want someone to say to your daughter or son, right? What would you do, right? You would start with what you could do and verbally express that. I'm going to write a letter. I'm not going to be silent about it. If they don't respond to my letter, guess what? I am going to get other people to try and intervene as well, right? And showing us that the community cares, right? Send us copies of those letters. Yo, somebody out there advocating and fighting for me. That's crazy. Right? And engage them and have us participate in that fight, right? Now that I'm writing a letter, I need you to write a letter. Right? What would you say to someone? Right? You ask them this, what would you say? Magic words you would say if you were in my shoes and you were talking to you. What would you say? Y'all learn together that way too, right? And it'll develop organically from there. Guaranteed. Don't have to have all the answers. Start the conversation. That's it. When a child is worth more than the worst mistake he ever made.
Yes. So that copy is not physically in the building, but it is in the catalog. We're working on ordering it. So if anybody wants to place that book on hold, there's a list back here on this table where you can write down your name and your library card number, and then that will all go ahead and put that in our system and place that book on hold for anybody who is interested. But speaking of free books and the fact that you are a published author, you mind telling us a little bit about those three books and what each of those is about and kind of lead to your writing process for those?
So when a child is worth more than the worst mistake he ever made is essentially a condensed version of my memoir, right? I kept it short because I didn't have the money to publish it at length the way I wanted to while I was in prison. It cost money, right? It was one of the books that largely was the catalyst for a bunch of the transformations I was making at the time while I was writing it. Because it forced me to have to go back and reevaluate my story from a critical perspective, right? All the people who had helped me, even though I couldn't see them as being helpful in the past, right? Forgiveness of my mother, while I blamed her for a lot of the wrongs that had happened into my life, I'd come to the conclusion that my mother was 16 when she had me, right? She was a juvenile lifer, essentially, right? And here I am asking the world for forgiveness for my wrongs, and I'm not willing to forgive my mother for not knowing how to raise me as a 16-year-old child. So that book was my memoir. The other book, one of the other books I've written is called A Black Man and a Spear, with the E in quotation marks, because it was my rediscovery of Shakespeare's works inside of the prison book discussion group, and some of my personal critiques of the material at that time while I was actually in the book discussion group, and it ranges from fanciful remarks to some constructive criticism about Shakespeare's and some racial components that I didn't like that I found in The Tempest and some of his other writings. And that I didn't really appreciate Shakespeare from the perspective that everybody else was selling it. And that's in there. And some of the experiences I was going through while I was in that book discussion group. The other one is Love is When You Want the Best for Someone Else. And it's actually letters, a compilation of letters that I had written to a woman who I once referred to as my soulmate. I had known her from childhood, and I kind of deified her in my mind while I was studying Black history and women's history in general, and her experiences. And my letters to her were published because she asked me not to publish hers in response, right? We had the belief as children that everybody else was living on borrowed time. It was just a matter of time before we would come back together someday and live happily ever after, right? That was not to be, and my growth and development process led me to fully understand that, but not blame her for her choices and inability to recognize that history is being possible, but that my expectations of her was a violation of her humanity, right? She had the right to choose. And that's what that book was. That's what that book chronicles. So, yeah.
No other questions. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to take a picture of the chessboard as it currently exists, so next Saturday we can continue this game.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Patrick. I'm sorry. I didn't.
See how he handles when the heat's on?
No.
So, but thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And, you know, I think in order to be passionate about an issue, and to become an advocate of that issue, it sometimes requires proximity to our own lives. It actually kind of disgusts me sometimes because, especially white male like myself, oftentimes when you hear them talking about certain issues, we'll use the Me Too movement as an example, and they'll talk about respect for women and women's rights. They'll oftentimes try to make themselves contextualize their closeness to it because we should respect women. I have daughters and I have mothers, and it's as though if an issue isn't somehow personally impacting our lives or someone in our lives, we have no reason to be invested in it. And I think that's absolutely deplorable. But I do think that in some situations it requires proximity to an issue in order to care about that issue. So I'm not sure how many of you in your lives know someone who is currently incarcerated or who was once incarcerated, but I encourage you to stay afterwards, get to know Antonio so that you do know somebody, so that you all can continue to be advocates and proximity is what is required. But I would say that by being here today, you are showing that this is a topic and interest that you are interested in, and hopefully this is just the start and not the finish of us working together as a community to reform this system.
Well said, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.